Looking at New York City from a distance, you realize that there is no visual center point, that you have clusters of skyscrapers scattered in downtown and midtown and now in Queens and in Brooklyn. And within that, you have many different buildings of many different architectural styles corresponding to the entire history of New York City, the few hundred years in which buildings have been being made and demolished and rebuilt and so on. And to contrast this from a pre-modern city has a very clear convention. Let's just call it the classical convention. And I'm speaking of, in Western history, the slow refinement of Greco-Roman architectural principles that we continue to see in our government buildings. The pre-modern city has at its center the ideological headquarters of society, the major cathedral, the most important institutions, government buildings, and so on. If we think about what a cathedral does as the central point of reference in a city, a beacon that brings people towards it, and as an aesthetic achievement, it instantiates the authority of society, the authority of clergy, the authority of the power structure. It endorses the power structures of society, and it provides a common sense of membership to the population of the city. They are all, in a sense, part of a collective project that adheres to the convention. This is the foundation of social cohesion for a pre-modern city, pre-modern societies. Looking back at a city like New York City, since its entire creation has been of the modern era, you don't have that convention. Rather, modern people are alienated from that convention. They are held together by mass culture. Mass culture substitutes the role of the classical convention from a pre-modern city. As we consume mass culture, popular culture, through television, through sitcoms, social media, on the internet, wherever we may consume it, we see a reference as to how other people behave, what's in fashion, and we achieve a sense of homogeneity from this. Yet it is vapid of any truly deep metaphysical sense of identity, of common identity, that people in a pre-modern society would find through their religion. Again, in the Western world today, postmodern society, you have a plurality of all these different ideologies, just as you have a plurality of different architectural ideals. But the plurality of different ideologies and religions, of the world religions and customs, their mutual presence together means that they can't all be true. And so it renders the singular ideology invalid. So it's devoid, mass culture is devoid of that singular common denomination of ideological cohesion. This condition also contributes to the sense of modern alienation that we experience today. Commerce and the development of a city through commerce happens on its own. It's like Adam Smith's invisible hand, in which these skyscrapers accumulate through the booms and busts of the market and through commerce, and they don't adhere to the singularity of vision that you see in city planning in pre-modern cities. So a great visual representation of this alienation is how European cities, old European cities, compartmentalize the old city from the new city. And the new city is where they allow the skyscrapers to develop. Giant glass skyscrapers that have no continuity with the past and don't seem to care much about the future either. They're disconnected. You don't see how they derive from architectural principles that have been accumulated over millennia. Rather, they appear as ends in themselves, like sculptures, built to be seen independently of their surroundings. Whereas, again, the pre-modern conventional city has a uniformity as it adheres to this convention. And that uniformity allows the architectural masterpiece to stand out as a highlight. That too instantiates the power structure of society. The authority of the institution is instantiated by that contrast. Whereas New York City, again, has been built with the ways of commerce, with the booms and busts of modern capitalism, where you have periods of intense economic activity and speculation and real estate development, which employs all the whole generations, architects and builders. And by the time an economic collapse comes and another period of economic flourishment arrives, you have a whole new set of architectural ideals and a whole new generation of builders. And so you have different buildings corresponding to different times, and it represents the history of booms and busts by the juxtaposition of different buildings and different architectural styles. By contrasting pre-modern cities with modern and postmodern architecture, as we see in New York, we grasp a sense of what the role of art is in society. That cities essentially are aggregations of art. And the perceived lack of coherence of a postmodern city, like New York, contributes to a general sense not only of alienation, but a sense of ugliness, that postmodern architecture is ugly. And there's a point to this. Roger Scruton has written about it extensively. Paul Joseph Watson has made several videos on architecture. And generally speaking, I agree with them, that postmodern architecture, it's alienating, it's ugly, but that there is an emerging convention, what I call an organic convention, and it has to do with an analogy to nature. So if you were to walk into a forest, a wild environment, and you see all around you trees that are dead, that are almost dead, that are young and just sprouting up, and you see all the different stages of life and decay, unfiltered, you have a sense of what the beauty of nature is. It's an inherent beauty. And that is what is emerging in our postmodern cities. The city is like a forest with different stages of decay. And where we have these rather ugly postmodern buildings, you also have a lot of graffiti too, as though it's bacteria growing and breaking down. And really, it's people taking claim of a city that they are estranged from. That is ultimately what graffiti is doing. And through contemporary art, you have the attempt of artists to fill in this gap where mass culture is providing the social cohesion, yet it doesn't have the religion. It doesn't have the deep truths of life embedded into it. It's devoid of that. And contemporary artists, through all their activity and creation, seem to want to inject this back into life and society. And so our very notion of art is more attached to contemporary artists, maybe to musicians, than it is to the aggregate of mass culture and entertainment and architecture. And so as we look and assess this development of pre-modern to modern to postmodern, we have some sense of trajectory, as though ideologies and customs of the past are dissolving. They're also at the same time dissolving into their core. That is to say that there are certain things that the religions of the world and the customs in the world have in common. You could see it in the way that Islamic calligraphy on the Dome of the Rock looks not too different from maybe a rose window in a Christian cathedral. There's a sense of sacred geometry in architecture of different ethnicities and different religions. There's a common denomination to human life that is cross-cultural and that is emerging from artists and has the potential to emerge through art. And that is ultimately what I believe contemporary artists are doing at their best. When they're at their best, they are introducing something very deeply personal, coiled deep within the psyche. And that is what is precisely missing from mass culture.